What's going on, guys? Magdallan here. I think right now might be one of the best times, maybe in the history of the genre, to be an ARPG player. And I thought it would be a fun time to make a video and just share some general overview type information about four of the games that I think are the main players in the space right now, in the hopes that it might be interesting or useful to you when you're trying to decide where you want to spend your time. And this is not going to be a review of these games. I'm going to try and set my own opinions aside for the most part and just give you the information, tell you what the games are about, and then let you make the decision for yourself. And so let's start with Path of Exile. So this game's been out for well over 10 years now. The graphics are somewhat dated, and there's a pretty wide variance in terms of the way that the skill effects look. Some of them look really modern and new, the ones that obviously have been designed in the last couple years, but there are other ones that look pretty dull and pretty dated. And so that's the thing to keep in mind if you are a really graphics driven type player. If you really want the scenery to look snappy and crisp and all that good stuff, then maybe Path of Exile is not the game for you. But in my view, graphics should probably take a second or even third place spot behind fun level and gameplay interest and stuff like that. But nonetheless, you do have to be honest when you're talking about Path of Exile. They have a new version of the game, Path of Exile 2, which is going to be coming out maybe at the end of this year, maybe a little bit later than that. And there's going to be some pretty extensive graphical updates at that point. But as it stands now, like I said, the graphics are starting to look a little bit dated. The game is available on PC and console, and there is multiplayer functionality. Though, for the most part, you're going to be playing by yourself. This is not really the type of game where, unless you have a specific group of people and a specific strategy in mind, in my time with the game, I have not found there to be a huge advantage to playing in a group. And in some cases, it is actually detrimental to do so in terms of drops and efficiency and so on and so forth. Now, in terms of the skill tree, Path of Exile is famous for their sprawling and extensive skill tree with tons of different options, and all of the classes interact with the same skill tree for the most part. There is a system of ascension where you pick a specific small tree that you get a very small number of points that you get to invest in it. But for the most part, all the classes will be winding their way through this same sprawling forest of passive nodes. And in terms of classes, Path of Exile has the Marauder, the Duelist, the Ranger, the Shadow, the Witch, the Templar, and the Scion. I'm not going to go over each individual class in this video, otherwise it's going to take forever. But generally speaking, the archetypes are there. If you want big smashy guy, you've got the Marauder. If you want to play a bow build or something like that, you've got the Ranger. If you want to do more of just a melee, dual wield swords or something like that, you've got the Duelist available, the Shadow. The Templar takes the role of like the Paladin type situation that most of the time. As I said, though, remember in this game, you're always interacting with the same tree. So if you want to make a tanky witch character, you can absolutely do that. And of course, the witch does all your spells and so on and so forth. And then the Scion is kind of a unique thing to Path of Exile where you don't even really unlock that until later on. And there's a very specific way that you build that character. And for the purposes of this overview video, I would say that it's mostly the Marauder, Duelist, Ranger, Shadow, Witch, and Templar. The Scion is kind of an added-on thing, a flavor class that is more for experienced players, I would say. And one of the huge draws with Path of Exile is there's basically endless build possibilities. It is a game where I would recommend that you, at least on your first playthrough, I would use a guide. I would find a build on YouTube or something like that you think is interesting and follow somebody else's sort of breadcrumb trail through learning the basics of the game. But once you've got that down, you can homebrew your own stuff. There's tons of ways you can build every class. The skills are not connected to the classes in the way that a lot of ARPGs are. And so you can 100% make, for example, a witch character that uses a bow but still casts spells. That's a possibility. There's infinite ways that you can set these things up. And as I said, there's no restrictions on which class can use what skill. And in that sense, I think Path of Exile is probably head and shoulders above any other game in the genre in terms of the complexity and variety that is available in terms of builds. That is not to say that the meta is always that open. There have been times where the meta has become quite stale in Path of Exile. So again, but I'll keep my opinions on that to myself. Suffice it to say, if you're somebody that likes to make a build, use a guide, and learn the game a little bit, and then kind of make up your own stuff and play through the campaign, whatever, Path of Exile's got you covered there. The campaign is very challenging, and there is an XP penalty on death as you progress. It starts at 5% as you're, I don't know, a third, 2/3 of the way through, and then once you get to end game, it's a 10% XP penalty, so very, very punishing there. And the respec system is pretty unforgiving, particularly at the beginning of a league. You do have to use currency items to do it, and you may find that as a new player, you don't have enough of them to do all of the respecking that you would want to do. It's been a big complaint of the community over time that Path of Exile should have a more forgiving respec system, at least for the campaign and for new players. The end game for Path of Exile is probably the most expansive and complicated in the genre. You can do maps, you can fight pinnacle bosses, and then you can also get into the capitalism simulator. And there are tons of different things that you can farm to try and make currency. With each league, they tend to introduce some kind of a new mechanic that you can farm. And there's the distinction between standard and league content where there are some players who, for example, their whole gig is they go into a league and try and accumulate wealth they can take back to standard because they want access to some of the really crazy items that exist there, or they want to do incredibly expensive, non-deterministic crafting stuff in standard that requires them to venture forth into the league to, accumulate more currency they can bring back and do that with. And in terms of, now I'm a map blaster, I tend to just play maps. But as I said, there's a ton of variety in terms of not only just what you do while you're mapping, but also the way that you set up each individual mechanic when you're doing so. There's, for example, breach. There's not just one way that you can utilize that mechanic to make currency throughout the course of a league. And so that's all I'll say about that. It's extremely complex, very rewarding. There's tons to learn. If you are the type of person that's very analytical, that likes to figure out a strategy and then get in there and execute that type of stuff, Path of Exile is probably the premier game in that department. In terms of the items and stuff like that, Path of Exile has fantastic chase items. There's Headhunter, which is a belt that lets you steal mods from the enemies that you kill. It's a very classic item in the game, extremely fun to play with. And there are lots of items like that you could play hundreds and hundreds and thousands of hours and never see one actually drop. And so a lot of times if something like that does drop, it's a huge moment for you as a player. And these are also items that people will spend weeks or even months farming up currency so they can buy and add to their characters. There is a very complex, rewarding, and expansive crafting system in the game, though opinions differ on the state of that system currently. But suffice it to say, if you're somebody that likes to really get in there and crunch numbers and try and make the best item that you can make, Path of Exile has that type of system available to you. As far as the development cycle, Path of Exile is on a 3, sometimes 4-month league cycle. And each league, they attempt to introduce a transformative new type of mechanic or gameplay element that you can engage with. And then when that league ends, all your characters go to standard and it starts again. And a couple weeks before each league, there is a hype season where they start to, give you little tidbits of information about what might be coming. That's where we're at right now. Path of Exile does have a new league that's going to launch at the beginning of April. And so now would be a great time to start learning about the game and figuring out if it's right for you. The monetization, the game is free to play, but they do sell stash tabs, which I would make the argument that they are at least in the ballpark of pay to win. You're going to need some stash tabs if you really want to engage with the trade system and if you want to be able to be efficient in the game. But other than that, they pretty much just sell cosmetics, which are quite expensive, but you don't have to buy any cosmetics and you can get by with just a few stash tabs. And otherwise the game is free to play and there's huge swaths of content to get into there. And so generally speaking, the community tends to be pretty supportive of grinding gear games in their monetization choices. There is a battle pass that they have introduced recently that rewards cosmetics, and some of those cosmetics do some stuff that you could make the argument does make your character easier to play or increases your ability to fully realize the power of your character. But generally speaking, you don't have to buy the battle pass. You can just ignore that completely. All right, let's move on to Last Epoch. So this game has, I think, pretty solid graphics. I think they're better than PoE currently and also better than Torchlight Infinite. And I would say, though, they are not as crisp as something like Diablo 4. They don't have the development budget or anything like that of Blizzard. But generally speaking, I think the graphics in Last Epoch are real good. The game's available for PC on Steam, and it does have co-op available as of their 0.9 patch, which just recently came out. There are fairly extensive skill trees that are unique to each class and subclass in the game. And the game has currently 5 base classes, and then you specialize from there into a host of, other subclasses. So they've got a mage, they've got the primalist, they've got the acolyte, the rogue, and then the sentinel. So far, I have played the sentinel, which is kind of like a paladin type situation. I think paladin actually might be one of the subclasses, but I played it as a void knight, which was pretty fun. And then I also played a rogue and did the marksman specialization, which was pretty similar to a bow build that you might play in Path of Exile. The game has a pretty decent amount of build possibilities. I found, particularly on my first playthrough and second playthrough, more casual style. I wasn't using a guide, and I was able to just kind of make up whatever I wanted and get through the campaign reasonably well. But the skills are locked to class, and so it does not have the immense variety of, build archetypes that Path of Exile does. You're not all sharing the same skill tree, and so that does limit it in some ways. I thought the campaign was very fun, very engaging, and it is more forgiving than Path of Exile, so there's not really, to my knowledge, there's no XP penalties whatsoever in the game, so when you die, you don't really lose anything. And respeccing is next to free. There is a small gold cost associated with it, but in my experience, that's been pretty much completely negligible. However, you cannot respec out of the subclass choice that you make, which, again, I for the most part, I want to keep my opinions out of it, but that seems kind of weird to me with how free they are with letting you respec. It would be cool if I could change the subclass of my character, but that's not a huge deal. The campaign's actually, like I said, pretty fun, and so if you want to do another character that is the same base class but with a different subclass, it's not that big of a deal to just do the campaign again. As far as endgame goes, Last Epoch is fairly limited right now. There is the monolith system that is similar to maps in Path of Exile. They also have an arena system, which is a wave-based type thing. And then they have dungeons, which are kind of, you run in, you do some mechanics or whatever, and then you fight the same boss. For each dungeon has its own boss that you fight each time. And the dungeons have several different difficulty levels. There are farming strategies associated with each one of those endgame content archetypes, and there are items that only drop in each one of those different types of content. I have not spent a huge amount of time messing around with these systems, but there's enough there to sink your teeth into a little bit. But in my experience, we are kind of at a point where we're waiting for the developers to really flesh out the end game and add to that. So there are not as much of a chase item system type stuff going on in Last Epoch than there is in Path of Exile. There are some items, I think, that are more rare than others, but generally speaking, I think it's just kind of a pool of uniques, with some being slightly more rare. The way that they have set it up so that there are some chase elements is items drop with legendary potential, which is a stat that will allow you to take another item, a rare item, and suck a couple of the affixes off of it and put them onto a unique item. And finding the specific item that you desire with 4 legendary potential is, to my understanding, incredibly rare. And so maybe you could make the argument that that kind of takes the place of the headhunter, so on and so forth from Path of Exile. But in my experience, it's not there yet. There's not the same degree of infinite farming potential and waiting for that crazy high value drop. But again, that might be something that comes later. Last Epoch is a fairly new game. There is a fun and intuitive and engaging crafting system in the game. Items can be broken down into crafting mats that you then use to add and change the affixes on your gear. And they also have a host of the other type of crafting interaction items that you would expect if you've played Path of Exile. I believe there is even the equivalent of a Mirror of Kalandra, though I have not dropped one yet. And I found that definitely the crafting system is more approachable than Path of Exile. But the problem of bricking items is still there. I guess it's not really a problem. It's just sort of a part of the system. But you won't always be able to make every item into the item that you want. You will definitely have lots of instances where, you get 2 or 3 of the affixes. You will definitely have situations where you get 2 or 3 of the affixes that you desire. And then when you're trying to get the last one, it might not work out and you have to get another item and start over. But generally speaking, it is a more forgiving, more deterministic, and more fun crafting system than Path of Exiles. It is not nearly as hardcore. And so if you're somebody that likes to craft, but you don't like the really high stakes type crafting stuff, then maybe Last Epoch might be for you. There is no league system yet, but they do have plans to implement one going forward. And I think that the game definitely needs that. And so it may be the type of thing where you might want to wait until their full release and figure out what their first league mechanic is going to be. That might be the best time to jump in. But currently they're in their 0.9 patch, which is, I assume, the last major patch before the full release. And the game is already a blast. And so monetization-wise, it's $35, gets you the full game experience. It does look like they have plans to sell cosmetics later. But generally speaking, of all the games I'm going to talk about today, this one is the most straightforward in how they're monetizing it. You buy the game is yours, you play the game, have a good time. And then just a last little disclaimer, the game is still technically in early access, beta, whatever. And there are some bugs that range from just minor little gripes to a few major system inconsistencies that people have pointed out in videos. But none of that really affected my fun level on the whole as I was playing through. Like I said, I made 2 characters so far, and I had a great time doing it. All right, now let's talk about Torchlight Infinite. I wasn't sure if I wanted to include this one on the list, but I have played it quite a bit, and lots of other Path of Exile content creators have also played it, and it's a pretty fun game. There are some problems, more problems than there are with Path of Exile or Last Epoch, but I think it's worth putting on the list because it offers a type of experience that the other 2 just don't. And so I think it is a game that for some folks, it would be, their pick out of the group. And so I wanted to cover it here. In terms of graphics, it has a more cartoony kind of World of Warcraft style graphics, but they're pretty good and they're pretty snappy. There's a fair amount of detail, but nothing of the order of Path of Exile or Last Epoch. So keep that in mind. It's available for PC and phone. And there is parity, so you can have the same account, log in, blast a few maps on your phone, and then sit down at the PC and fire it up through Steam and play the same character. And of the games that I'm going to cover here, it's the only one that has that type of cross-platform situation going on. And there is no multiplayer, as far as I know. I think they want to implement it, but they just haven't gotten to a point where they've been able to do so. Torchlight has a highly customizable skill tree system where you choose a base tree and then you get to choose a combination of several other trees within a given class. It's a little bit complicated, but definitely not to the order of Path of Exile. I would say it's right around the same level of complexity as Last Epoch, maybe a little bit less intuitive. And in terms of classes, they name the classes a little bit differently. So you've got Commander Moto, that's like a summon guy. You've got Oracle Thea, which is some kind of a mage type situation, I believe. You've got Divine Shot Carino, which is your bow guy. Berserker Rahan, which is obviously your, smashy guy. Then you've got Frostfire Gemma, which is an ice and fire mage type situation. Then you've got Cat Eye Erica, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a cat girl archetype where you have, I believe, claws are the weapon type that is used. And then you've got Space Time Witness Yuga, which is not one that I have played. I don't really know a whole lot about, but I believe that is another caster type base class. And then again, as you progress your character, you get the option to select several trees that you can then put points into. And then there are some, after you put so many points in each tree, you unlock a selection of, major skill choices, keystone type things if you're a Path of Exile player. And then on top of that, you make quite a few choices along the way of major passives that are associated with your base class. And so there's a lot going on there with customization as far as making builds in the game. I think there is a pretty high level of build diversity for casual players, but a complaint that I've seen quite a bit is that there's less diversity at the very top of the end game. And so if you're somebody that's really hardcore, there might not be that many builds per character class. I think it kind of does get pigeonholed a little bit because the final content in the game is pretty demanding in terms of being able to output huge amounts of damage and so on and so forth. But for the average player, I felt like I was able to, in both the leagues that I played, just kind of pick up a class, make up a build, get through the base game, and get a footing well into the mid-range, maybe a little bit further than that into the end game. The campaign for Torchlight Infinite is really fun. I've enjoyed it quite a bit every time I've played it. The XP penalty on death, I don't think starts until a much higher level, and so you just really won't encounter that. It's not a big deal at all in the campaign. And then respecking is free until level 80, and then there is a currency item that's required to do it after that, but especially once the league is a week or two old, you can get a huge number of that currency item for just one flame elementium, which is the divine orb or exalted orb equivalent. It's the currency of trade. There is an engaging and relatively large endgame system that they've implemented. There's 8 tiers of maps that all have bosses in them, and then there are some pinnacle bosses. And also the maps are broken into little regions. You complete so many maps, and then you can do a boss that's associated with that region. And then again, once you do so many of those, then you can begin to challenge like the pinnacle boss of the game. And with each league, they have also introduced another, pinnacle style boss encounter that you can grind your way up to being able to challenge, that has unique drops and so on and so forth. The game does have an auction house. It is the only game so far that I have discussed that actually has that kind of a feature. And it is strangely limited to prevent bots, I believe, from taking over. So it does not have the search functionality that you're going to desire. But nonetheless, it is a system that if you want to be able to just go and interact with an in-game interface, find an item that you want, and then just buy it and not have to worry about somebody whispering you back or dealing with the player directly, then this is the only game that has anything like that that's on this list. And I guess to backtrack slightly, in Last Epoch, they do not currently have trade, but that is coming. I don't know if that's going to happen soon in the next month or two, or if it's something that's coming down the line, but they have announced the way that they're going to do it, and it does look pretty interesting. So that's worth keeping in mind as far as Last Epoch is concerned. And then back to Torchlight Infinite. So there is a partly deterministic but very enjoyable crafting system. There's almost no bricking of items, and you can pretty much make the item that you want given enough time and currency. And they also have a corruption system that's similar to that of Path of Exile, which I think I've had a pretty good time messing around with it. I haven't gotten super deep into it, but the more seasoned content creators that I have seen, the more crafting oriented guys that have made videos, even the ones that at first kind of balked at the system, have kind of come around to it and generally given it the thumbs up. I think they've basically got at least the skeleton of a really good crafting system that's only going to get better as the game develops over time. Torchlight does have chase unique items. There is a headhunter type equivalent item, and then there are a few other very rare unique items that are those holy shit, I dropped the crazy item moment creators. And so that is, I think, always a plus. They do have a 3-month league cycle, and so far they've done 2 leagues. The first one I thought was really fantastic. The second one, maybe not as fantastic. It was a pirate themed thing, but still really enjoyable. I still did not regret making a character and playing through the campaign and getting into the end game. And monetization wise, it is free to play, but there are mild to harsh pay to win elements depending on who you ask. There is gacha systems for cosmetics and pets, and the pets do contribute to character power. So if you are the type of player that if there is pay to win elements at all, that you're not going to play it, then Torchlight's not for you. If you're like me and you don't really care a whole lot, as long as it's not super intrusive, then this might be a fun side game for you. And if you're on the other side of the spectrum where you have cash, you don't care, you're ready to swipe that card and stomp some noobs, then Torchlight might be for you. And then lastly, let's talk about Diablo 4. Disclaimer, this game has not released yet, and it's not like last Epoch where it's in early access or something and you can just keep playing. They just did an open beta weekend, which I've covered on the channel, so if you want to know more about my thoughts, you can check those videos out. But this game, we know way less about it than any of the other ones I've mentioned, and so take everything I'm saying here with a grain of salt. But given that this is a game that's on the horizon, I thought that it made sense to include it in here, because if this is the game that you're thinking, oh, I'm going to get into this one, then you only have to wait a couple months for it to come out. So Diablo 4 has AAA graphics, so huge development budget, and so as you would expect, the graphics are of a very high quality, very high fidelity, huge levels of detail. And then the game is available on PC and console, and it is kind of a hybrid ARPG MMO. Unlike the other games on this list, you will encounter other players as you're just running through zones, and you can, group up as well and do content as a group. But even if you're playing by yourself, you will still just encounter other people on the map. There is a streamlined but relatively limited skill tree system, which are locked to each individual character class. So there's no mixing and matching or anything like that. It's not at all like Path of Exile where you're on the same tree, and it's not even as customizable as something like last Epoch where you are picking a character class and then you pick a subclass later on. If you pick the Barbarian, you're a Barbarian, and there is going to be some customization that happens at the very end game with the Paragon system. But generally speaking, of the games that I have listed, Diablo 4 has the smallest skill trees, and it has the least variety in terms of builds that are presented to you, even if later on there might be, some additional builds that come out, so on and so forth. But given the information that we do have, which again is limited, Diablo 4 does have the least variety and least intrigue associated with the skill tree system of the games that I have listed. In terms of classes, there's the Barbarian, the Rogue, the Sorcerer, the Druid, and the Necromancer, so all classics of the genre. I don't think I need to really describe for you what those classes are, although it is worth noting that the Druid is widely considered to be the worst of those classes. So if you are somebody who's like, yeah, I really want to play a class where I can turn into a bear, then maybe take a look at last Epoch. Otherwise, I'll try and keep, as I said, I'm going to keep my opinions for the most part to myself. So otherwise, I listed them for you. Those are the ones that are available, and pick at your own risk in that, as far as that goes. There is the potential in Diablo 4 for some variety in endgame builds, but I think that's going to be determined more once the game comes out and we see how the end game uniques, set items, etc., all of that turns out. They haven't given us a huge amount of information about how that's going to work. And then in terms of the campaign, it's functional, and it has story elements that most people have praised pretty highly. And so the general consensus is that if you are a story-driven player, that this might be the game for you. I have my own opinions, but again, if you're interested in that, you can watch the other videos that I've done on Diablo 4 on the channel thus far. In Diablo 4, there is no XP penalty that I know of, and it has the easiest respec on the market. There's a gold cost that I think scales a little bit, but from what I saw, at least in the beta, it's completely negligible. If you want to respec your class over and over, you absolutely can, which I think is a fantastic element to have in the game. And then in terms of endgame, of course, again, we have limited info, but the main thrust, the mapping style system, is going to be dungeons, which many have said could get boring, but we'll just have to see when the game comes out. The developers have said that there's actually a huge number of these dungeons, and so there very well may be enough of variety there when you start to add in, endgame affixes being added onto them and league mechanics on top of that, and so on and so forth. It could be good. We'll have to see in that department. And then there are also world bosses, which I did one of those in the beta, and I really liked it. I thought the world boss was really cool. And so I don't know how big of a part of endgame progression those are going to be, but it's cool to see that in an ARPG setting. I made this comment in another video recently. The world boss really reminded me of the world bosses from Rift, which was an MMO I played many years back. And so if you like the concept of, every so often the huge boss pops up in a zone and you get together with a bunch of other players and try and beat the thing down, you got other players getting killed in one hit by mechanics all over the place and so on and so forth. If that's your jam, then Diablo 4 is really the only ARPG that I know of that has that going on. In terms of crafting, it's a pretty limited set of options. There is an affix system that lets you add a unique modifier to an item, and that's kind of cool. And then there is a simple item upgrade system that you do, I believe, with gold and with materials that you kind of pick up throughout the zones, a la, harvesting or whatever in an MMO. And then items can be socketed with gems. There was talk of them bringing back the rune word system from Diablo 2, but that just ended up not happening. I don't think they're doing that. Maybe they're going to do it in the future. But as of now, that's kind of where we're at with crafting in the game, so we'll see if they expand that over time. There's the potential for chase items at endgame, but again, we're going to have to see in that department. As far as I was able to tell in the beta, there is at least one, if not two, entire rarities of items that they have not allowed to drop and haven't really shared a whole lot of information about that only become available towards endgame, towards the higher difficulty levels of the game, of which currently I believe there are 4 in the game. It's called world difficulty or something like that. And so again, some item tiers won't even drop until later on, and so we'll have to wait to see what that's like when the game comes out. They do plan on doing a standard, league system like Path of Exile, but again, information's kind of limited on that. But the devs have made some pretty big claims in terms of what they want to do with that system, and if they're able to deliver, it could really smooth out a lot of the criticisms that some content creators, myself included, have had about the game as the beta progressed. And then lastly, for monetization, Diablo 4 is somewhere between $70 and $100 depending on which version you get, and they also have Battle Pass options. And then I believe they are also going to be selling cosmetics. So definitely the highest buy-in price tag of any of the games that I've listed here. And so you'll have to decide, depending on to what degree price is a factor in your game choice. If you're strapped for cash, then you might want to look at something like Path of Exile or Torchlight that are free to get into. If money's pretty tight, but you've got a little bit of budget, you can get into Last Epoch for $35. And if you've got the money to spend and Diablo 4 looks really interesting to you, then you're looking at $70 to $100 to get in, and then probably $10, $20, $30 here and there for battle passes, and then more on top of that if you get into cosmetics. And that is about all I've got for you guys today. I hope you found some of that information useful, interesting, engaging, whatever. If you did, please do give me a like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments section below of the 4 games I talked about here, which ones have you played? Did I miss any information that would be important for other people to know? And just generally, what game are you going to be playing going forward? And yeah, I hope to see you guys in the next video. I appreciate you.